Sleepless by Malvoish. Chapter 1. Nebula felt herself getting pushed to the ground. Her gun already in hand, she turned to face her attacker. In an instant, her blood ran cold. Time seemed to have stopped as her shocked glance laid on Peter. The man's face was contorted in obvious pain, pale as a ghost. Nebula couldn't even open her mouth as Peter's opened, spitting out red blood, covering half of his face and the ground in front of him. She could smell the metallic scent that was filling the air between them. It made her nauseous. "Peter!" Peter's legs finally gave up under his weight and he fell to his knees. Nebula jumped up, catching him. Holding her injured captain, she noticed the cause of his injury. Several black blades were stabbed through his body, reaching out from his stomach, covered in blood. His blood! Now being alerted, Nebula looked around, shielding Peter from more harm as much as it was possible for her. Pointed gun in the air, ready to shoot anything that got near them. Her eyes observed restless surroundings. In the side of her eye she saw something move, and she shot. She heard bones breaking and the sound of someone falling on the ground. As if it was the signal, 4 others emerged from the shadows of the trees, attacking her all at once. Being forced to let go of the injured man in her arms, Nebula got up, not leaving Peter's side as she fought their attackers. The once green grass around them had been dyed in several types of blood, filling the air with the scent of death. Once Nebula couldn't see nor sense anymore. Enemies she got back to Peter, who was laying in the same position she had left him. Falling to the ground, she carefully propped Peter in her arms, holding his head up, which caused him to vomit a gush of blood. Nebula had thought he was passed out, until his eyelids fluttered open. Looking at her as much as possible for him, he took several deep breaths and Nebula could feel rattle in his thorax. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Only another rush of blood. "Rocket? Rocket, someone needs to come get us. Peter is injured. I can't move him. I have no med pad. Rocket, you need to come now." She started to ramble in her communicator, looking at the bleeding man in her lap. She hadn't felt this desperate in a long time. So helpless. It didn't take Rocket long to answer her call. "I tracked you down. We will be there any minute. How bad is it?" She wanted to lie, to not speak it out loud. Didn't want it to worry anyone on the ship. Didn't want it to worry Peter himself, who had a hard time keeping his eyes open. Swallowing the boulder in her throat, she answered, "He's dying." Rocket was silent until she heard him yell before the connection went quiet, and she was left alone with Peter dying in her arms. The man didn't break eye contact with her. It felt eerie to see him like this, sucked out from life. It felt unnatural. She hated it. "Why did you do that?" Her voice was so thin, shaking with every word. "You know I wouldn't have died from this. You're a fucking idiot, Star-Lord." Trying to keep him awake with their usual banter, but Peter only smiled. The blood made it look surreal and cursed, something that would haunt Nebula in her dreams. Again taking deep breaths, he tried to speak, only getting out short words. His voice so quiet he wasn't even a whisper. She wanted to tell him to stop talking, but she felt like she was about to burst into tears the moment her mouth opened. "Oh, glad. You... okay." Nebula's heart sank in her chest, and the tears she had swallowed down now bursted out. Big tears dropped on his face. How could he say something like this? He was bleeding out, and his only response was this? His mouth moving, forming silent words Nebula couldn't understand. Holding his head in her palm, she whispered reassurance in his ear. "It's gonna be okay. Hold on, please. Peter." Chapter 2. Nebula didn't know if she should consider it a curse or a blessing to not rely on sleep. Once her body sensed any type of adrenaline rise that suggested a possible dangerous situation. It sure was helpful in any fight and observing situation. There was a time she didn't crave sleep, didn't needed it. Being so much younger back then, every time her eyes closed, nightmares haunted her. Made her wake up crying, silently out of fear to be heard. Back then, before their rivalry, before her modifications, Gamora had done her best to calm her. Maybe she was just afraid to get in trouble, but it was one of the few occasions she actually had felt like she had a sister that cared about her. But right now, She wishes she could sleep. A dreamless rest to let her forget her guilt for a moment. The guilt to have almost caused the man's death she lost her heart to, because now every time her eyes closed and her dreams began, she saw Peter, covered in blood, lifeless. It made her wake up, crying and cursing herself. With both feet on the cushion, Nebula was sitting in Peter's room, staring blank into the darkness, trying not to think about anything, but it was hard when your friend was lying in his bed, recovering from his injuries that almost killed him, because he thought it was a wise idea to protect you from an attack that may had injured you but not as severe as him. That idiot had almost died. For nothing. For somebody who didn't need to be protected. She had understood if it was anyone else from their team, even Groot and Drax. They all were mortal. They all didn't have self-healing prosthetics. The injury that almost had Peter killed would have barely done her harm. Eventually, some leaking blood. A wound that was healed an hour later. Maybe 2. Peter should have known no. Peter knew, so why had he done it anyway? Thankfully, their team had shown up fast enough to heal Peter from the life-threatening injury, but it still had taken a toll on his body. He definitely would have long-term problems with his respiration, since one of the blades had barely missed his lungs, but was still close enough, and he would be left with scars on his back and stomach. Peter had been on strict bed rest since, but he also hadn't been much awake since then either. That had been a week ago, and Nebula hadn't slept an entire night since, if the half-an-hour naps she forced herself into, to keep at last some piece of mental stability, even counted as sleep in the first place. But she didn't feel like leaving Peter's side. Wanted to make sure his recovery was going well. It was the most she could do at the moment. Nebula? At the sound of her name, she sat up straight, hammering hard in her chest. She wouldn't lie. She hadn't expected Peter to be awake, so it had startled her. "You're still here, right? Didn't I told you to get some sleep?" Listening to Peter move in the sheets, she watched him prop himself up and lean back with a sigh on his lips, followed by a restrained cough. "No, and we told you to stay in bed. I'm in bed. You never said something about just laying down. And my back feels sore as fuck." Nebula scoffed in response as she pulled a chair next to his bed to settle down. When Peter moved himself, making space on his bed, he lifted his blanket and nudged under it. "Come here, will you?" With a sense of horror, she stared at him. "I'm not tired. Also, what makes you think I'm gonna share a bed with you?" Peter scoffed. "Sure you are, Nebs. You think you are all sneaky with crashing on my couch for a week now, except that you forget the crashing. You might be part cyborg, but I know that you need sleep. So come in here now. And don't tell me you will sleep on the couch, because I know you won't. Here, I can at last supervise your stubborn ass." Nebula sighed, defeated. There was no need of arguing with Peter. She still could just leave. But again, she wanted to be with him right now. Taking off her shoes, she sat next to Peter, who immediately laid the blanket over her. "Do. I actually have a no-clothes rule in my bed, but I give you a pass, just for today. Don't push your luck, Quill." Listening to him snickering, she rolled her eyes and actually laid on her back. Not about to sleep yet, but to just lay down for once in a few days. Maybe she'd drift off to sleep. Maybe not. Before she had been sleepless because of her guilt. Now she'd be restless because the man she had been in love with had offered her to share his bed with her. Showed concern about her not sleeping. What was ironic at this point, but she wouldn't tell him. They fell silent, but the type that was comfortable. Each of them just being next to each other. Peter listening to some songs on his Zune. Nebula could hear the melody, and it made her close her eyes. It almost seemed as if Peter chose the slow, relaxing songs on purpose. Rolling on her side, she got more comfortable. Maybe it was the soft pillow under her head. Or actually laying on a mattress. Maybe it was also Peter being awake around her, being more or less healthy, that took a bit of the guilt and tension off her. Maybe everything combined. "I'm in love with you, by the way." Nebula's eyes snapped right back open. She must have misheard it, right? Not moving an inch, she stared at the wall. Her heart was hammering in her chest. "You asked me why I did it, and this is my answer. I mean, I had done it for everyone, probably you know me. But that I'm in love with you made me forget about, Your bodily situation. I just saw the woman I get googly eyes for getting attacked. I know it wasn't my smartest move, but hey, you don't know me any better, right? Peter laughed, leaning back, sucking in air between his teeth. Okay, no laughing for me. God, that burned. Shit, Nebula still hasn't moved. She just stared in the corner of the room, trying to calm her heart. Was Peter messing with her? But why would he do it like this? He was a dick, but even he had boundaries. And fake confessing to someone, especially a friend, didn't seem like his deal. Nebula, are you awake? Peter's voice got quiet. The mattress shifted, and Nebula closed her eyes again, pretending to sleep. She didn't see it, but she knew Peter was leaning over her, probably with his puppy look staring at her. Good for her that she had perfectioned the art of fake sleeping. Huh, I thought you were awake. Told you were tired. He had a giggle in his voice. Guess I will tell you when you wake up. Nebula felt his hand stroke over her head, and suddenly felt a touch she couldn't identify on her temple, along with Peter's beard brushing over her cheek. She was so tempted to open her eyes to see what this soft touch was, but she feared the situation would be awkward, so she kept them closed, hoping Peter wouldn't notice her act. Nuasits. Sleep well, Nebs. Peter shifted back in his previous position and turned his Zune back on. It passed some time until she felt Peter laying down again, soft tunes and snoring reaching her ears. She took a deep breath while opening her eyes again. Listening to Peter's sounds, she made sure the man was actually sleeping and not pretending like she did. Turning in her position, she faced Peter now, watching his sleeping face, eyes closed, mouth ajar, snoring. The Zuni's earbuds still in his ears playing music. He looked peaceful, in his own way, and it made Nebula realize that despite him being on death's threshold just a week ago, he was going to be okay. But now there is another issue occupying her mind. Was he being serious? He had no reason to mess with her. At last, not about something like that, but it felt surreal. Maybe his medication was messing with his head, made him imagine that she was Gamora. But he had said her name, not the one of her sister. Nebula felt her heart drop, fear boiling up in her guts. She was afraid of the next morning, afraid to face Peter's confession, afraid to reveal her own feelings. She tucked herself from under the blanket, almost falling to the ground. Grabbing her shoes, she slowly made her way to the door, cursing herself for being a coward. Chapter 3. With ease lifted Nebula the last crate of supplies in the storage place. If there was one thing she somewhat was grateful for in her cyborg attributes, it was the strength she had. It made her job much easier. Rolling her shoulders, she sat herself on one of the boxes, looking around, observing nowhere as citizens in their lives. It was peaceful in its own way, until she saw Mantis walking up to her, almost running, and she looked mad. Why aren't you with Peter? I thought you wanted to make sure he was healing. Nebula looked up at Mantis, who was hovering about her. Her fun mirrored disappointment and disbelief. He is fine, Mantis. I caught him in the hallway. He said he's looking for you. Because he has something important to tell you? He still looks bad, as much as he says he's fine. Avoiding Mantis's eyes, she looked around. Well, he was stabbed multiple times. Even a med pack can't heal this fully. He knows that, but he's an idiot. Mantis grunted, untypical for her. Even if she didn't want to, Nebula looked at her and regretted it. Big, dark insect eyes look at her, frowning. She definitely meant it. Nebula, he did that for you? How can you say he's an idiot? I didn't ask him to, Mant. He did it out of his free will. She lowered her eyes, not wanting to face Mantis anymore, fearing that her empathy suddenly worked by soul eye contact. I already feel bad enough about it. You know that. Mantis knew. Mantis knew that Nebula was beating herself down because of it. The day Peter almost died still sat heavy in their guts. Sure, he was out of danger now, but remembering how he looked when they picked them up won't go away that easy. Pale, almost white like a sheet. The only color on him was his blood that was all over his body. Clothes, face, the ground around him. Nebula. She had been just as much covered in Peter's blood as he was. Even her face had stains that looked like she had whipped over it with her bloody hands. Mantis knew it had been tears. Nebula's swollen eyes had been a giveaway, and also the fact that she had catched her crying in the medbay while she cleaned up Peter from his blood after they had gotten him in a stable state again. And, Mantis just wanted to show her comfort, so she reached for her shoulder. But Nebula winched away. "Don't touch me now. Please. I didn't want it to. I know, but don't. Please." Mantis didn't need her empathy to know what Nebula was feeling at the moment. Despite her rough appearance, once you knew her, Nebula had been an open book. At last, to her. That's why she was so confused about her not being with Peter anymore. Since that accident, she hadn't left his side. Even with everyone in the group offering her to switch so she could get rest, Mantis even had tried to get her to sleep. That had caused a minor fight between the two. Fact was that it was nearly impossible to get Nebula away from Peter in the last week. So seeing her not with him sparked worry in her. Did you had a fight? Did something happen between you two? Is that the reason he's roaming around looking for you? Mantis sat next to her, keeping space between them so Nebula didn't feel like she was trying to manipulate her. Nebula shifted in her position, still not looking at her worried friend next to her. Feeling Mantis's eyes on her made her quite uncomfortable because she knew she wasn't going to get out of the situation without saying anything. Staring at her feet, she threw her thoughts over, trying to find the right words without fully exposing the nights happening 3 days ago. "Oh, do you have the expression that Peter is acting strange?" Yeah, that had been a weird approach, but maybe Mantis had noticed something. Maybe Peter had been acting strange, and Simple thought she was No, I think he's acting normal again. He's just really annoyed to stay in bed, but I think he's our old Peter. Nebula nodded, licking her lips nervously. Sure, this didn't prove anything, but only drunk Peter had ever mistaken her for her sister. He neither had been drunk nor on any high medication that night. She felt her heart taking a leap. She laid her hand on her chest. Why? Had he said something weird to you? Finally looking at Mantis, she was greeted by the other woman's way-to-close face, her dark eyes sparkling in a childlike curiosity. Nebula recoiled. Again, a few moments passed in which Nebula changed her position, calmed by her feelings, leaning back, raising her head and looking up. She needed someone's opinion. She needed to talk to someone or she'd go crazy in her own thoughts. Only if you promise me to tell nobody. Not a single soul. Not Drax, not Groot, not even Peter. You need to promise me, Mantis. The other woman must have heard the urgency in Nebula's voice, because she looked at her now serious, nodding. I promise. Nebula felt her mouth getting dry. She opened her mouth a few times in an attempt to talk, but there was always the thought of not using the right words. She swallowed a few times before sighing. 3 days. The last time I was with him, he told me he's in love with me. It felt surreal to speak it out loud. It sounded so different in her head, but actually hearing it felt weird, like it was something she never even dreamed of saying out loud. She waited for Mantis's reaction, but nothing came from her. So Nebula looked at her, just to find her with her hands covering her mouth, but her wide smile was still obvious, her eyes now shimmering in a sense of happiness. Her antennas were straight in the air and glowing. Oh my, I can't believe he finally told you. Now Nebula was the one looking at her in disbelief. Wait, you knew? Duh, of course. He's my brother. We talked about it. Mantis nodded and rolled her eyes. I was even the one telling him to finally confess to you. There was no way of any words coming out of Nebula's gaping mouth at the moment. Mantis knew about Peter being in love with her? And they talked about it? Did the entire team know? Now there were more questions in her head as before. But maybe this wasn't so bad after all. Not the entire team knowing, that would be a nightmare, but Mantis knowing. Do you think he's sincere about it? Absolutely. Mantis didn't even hesitate to answer. Her voice is surprisingly serious. So what did you say? She started her answer quite unintelligently. I panicked. I guess, and pretended to sleep. Mantis looked at her, clearly being confused. And when he fell asleep, I ran away. Yeah, she should make it a habit of saying certain things out loud before doing them. Listening to herself now made her feel pathetic. She still had acted the same at last in this situation. I don't understand. I thought you loved him too. Huh, how do you know? Have you used your powers on me? I'm an empath. Even without using my powers, I know how to interpret people. She held her hand open towards her. Gimme your hand real quick. Nebula hesitated. She didn't want to expose too much of herself, but she was curious and, honestly, feeling helpless. As she put her right hand into Mantis's, who wrapped her other hand around hers as well. Closing her eyes, her antennas straightened out, the tips glowing. After a few moments, her eyes opened again. Mantis's soft face looking at her, caring. She smiled. You love him so much, Nebula. It feels as warm as his love for you. I think you should tell him. I don't think I'm ready for this. That's okay, but you still should talk with him. He's making himself crazy. Promise me you will talk to him. She was scared to talk to Peter, but Mantis was right. Ooh, I will. Chapter 4. Peter stared at the ceiling of his room, thinking, wondering, worrying. All those words were fitting for his recent thoughts. He hadn't seen Nebula in several days. Sure, she had her own duties, her own life, but she had spent the entire week after his accident in his room, watching over him like a guard dog. Her suddenly disappearing from one day to another just seemed out of character for her. And if it wasn't for any other of the guardians reassuring him that she was okay, he'd deeply worry about her. At last, he knew that she was doing okay. It was just that he missed her. Waking up from the smell of fresh cooked coffee for him. He didn't even like coffee, but she made the perfect cup every morning for him, them bantering about trivial things. Or her actually listening to his stories, if it was just a really detailed reenacted telling from his favorite movies or childhood stories. She would be sitting with him, either at the bed or couch, a few times even with him on the bed, and listen to him, throwing in her thoughts to it. He missed waking up to see her looming in his room, laying on his couch or curled up in a chair. He just missed her presence. Good morning, Peter. Startled by his door suddenly being opened in an almost kicked manner, he sat up, cursing because his still-healing body wasn't prepared for his sudden movements. Rubbing his side, he watched Mantis walking into his room, carrying a bag with her, which she immediately threw next to him on the bed. Morning, Mantis? First of all, what the fuck did you bring in here? Roaming in her bag, she pulled out some bottles of water and soda, some cookies and other unhealthy food. All in all, it looked like you put a 10-year-old in charge of grocery shopping. I got your groceries. She chirped and ripped open a bag of chips, starting to eat. You know I could do my own grocery shopping if you'd let me out of my room. It's not that he wasn't thankful, but he started to feel like a prisoner. He also slowly started to get claustrophobic. Mantis watched him closely, reaching for his hand, patting it. She nodded. Peter nodded back. They smiled at each other. No. Oh, come on! Throwing his hands up, he fell back into the mattress, rubbing his face. That is torture. What are you punishing me for anyway? I protect Nebula from getting killed and you put me in house arrest? No, you almost got yourself killed. Injured so heavy not even a med pack could fully heal you. It's for your own best, Peter. Peter rolled his eyes. Sure, he almost died, but this wasn't the first time. In fact, almost dying was one of his favorite activities. So have you told her about your feelings? Of course, Mantis knew about his feelings towards Nebula. Even if she had learned about it by accident, she literally just touched his arm when he was talking to Nebula and had felt his emotions. But instead of being weirded out by him being in love with his dead girlfriend's little sister, she was really supportive. He was grateful for that, even with her trying to push him to confess the entire time. Yup, kind of. Peter bites his lips, signing. The last time she was here, I offered to let her to sleep in my bed because I don't think she slept at all in the last week. We were just chilling and then I just blurted it out. I told her why and all. He was interrupted by his sister. Aw, what did she said? Nothing. She was already asleep. I wanted to tell her again the next day, but I haven't seen her since, and you did not let me out so I could look for her." Peter stopped, thinking. Now, as he spoke it out loud, it all started to make sense. Do you think she was awake and heard it, but was so uncomfortable she fled from me, just to not break my heart? Watching his sister closely, she looked nervous, fidgeting with her shirt. She knew something, and was hiding it from him. Leaning closer to her, he put on his serious face. Mantis slid back in her chair, avoiding his eyes. "What do you know, Mantis?" Carefully, Peter peeped out his door, watching closely his surroundings. It was honestly ridiculous how he needed to sneak out his own room. Once he saw nobody around, he wondered for a second if he could have left his room all the time. Already he stepped out. His destination, Nebula's room, was just a few meters away. He didn't want to annoy her or make her uncomfortable, but she avoided him because she pretended to sleep, as he confessed to her had left a mark on his heart. He didn't want her to fall over his neck. Confessed to him too, although he would like this. But he didn't want to lose one of his closest friends because of his feelings. There was a need to clear up the situation, and when Nebula was avoiding it, he needed to take it into his own hands. Stopping in front of Nebula's door, he took a deep breath before knocking. "Nebula?" He heard a rumble from the other side. A look through her window revealed Nebula jumping in her bed, pulling over her blanket. It made him chuckle. "You know I can see you, right?" Silence, waiting for a few more minutes before stepping in her room. He saw her winch as the door opened. "Oh, sorry to just burst in, but Mantis said you wanted to talk to me. So I waited the entire day, patiently. Be proud of me for that. But you didn't show up, so I needed to sneak out and come here. So, yeah, I'm here." Nebula sat up, facing him. Her dark eyes looked at him, and it was one of the occasions he could read her. She looked scared, nervous, and tired. Yeah, she hadn't slept, and Peter felt bad about it since he was the reason for her insomnia. He stepped closer to her, pulling a chair along with him on which he let himself fall down, taking a big breath, mentally preparing. He had found the courage 3 days ago. Why was he nervous now? I'm in love with you, too." Peter's mouth fell open, looking at Nebula in disbelief. I heard you that night. I was just afraid. It came so sudden, and I still don't know if it isn't just something you came up with while you were on death's threshold. I've been in love with you for several months now," he quickly threw in. "It wasn't a close-to-death decision. Trust me. Listen, I just finally needed to get it off my chest. I almost fucking died and I never told you. I mean, I tried, but I was bleeding out like crazy, and my voice was pretty much cut off. This doesn't have to become anything if you don't feel ready for this type of commitment. I just need you to know." Feeling her heart burst with each word, Nebula swallowed hard before she felt something wet dripping down her cheeks. In disbelief, she raised her hand and whipped some tears off her face, confused. Just a second later, Peter had cupped her face and whipped her tears off himself. His hands were warm, calloused, but still soft. Defeated, she leaned into his touch. "How do you know?" Again, Peter fell into silence. She let him collect his thoughts, taking the time to sort her own because right now she was overflowing with different emotions. Confusion, desire, anger, a happiness that made her feel like she could dance, like the first time she realized she had feelings for Peter. I just do. Real talk. I had my fair share of massive crushes in my life, but in love, not so much. So trust me when I tell you I know when I'm in love. But why are you in love with me, of all people? I'm not your soft-faced beauty you can show off. I'm rough, and I'm hideous. Peter was clearly overwhelmed by her question, and really suppressed the anger he felt when she called herself hideous. You really expect an answer from me now, huh? Okay. He took a deep breath. I like your attitude. You give me contra when we argue. Also, our banters? I dig them. Highlight of my day. I like how you have grown. You were so, reserved when you came to us. all to yourself, but now? I've real fun seeing you just being yourself. Because by all means this is a compliment. You're actually kind of an idiot yourself. I like how caring you are. Despite your past, you have a good heart, and that makes you so likable. In my case, lovable. And who says I couldn't show you off? Excuse me, but you're not only beautiful, but also hot. Like an attractive hot. But even with a lower hotness level, I'd show you off. Because it's you. Scratching the back of his head, he looked at her. Nervous. Her heart swelled in her chest. She could feel it in her throat. She still felt nervous, unsure, but she would lie if she didn't admit that Peter's words were something she had dreamed about hearing. But she was scared. I'm terrified, she admitted. I never felt that way. There was so much more she wanted to tell him, how much she didn't deserve him, how she felt terrible for falling in love with her dead sister's boyfriend, for her being the reason he almost died. It's okay. I'm scared too. Getting lost in his soft eyes, watching him getting lost in hers. Her cheeks felt like burning when Peter leaned closer to her, tilting his head. After a felt eternity, their lips finally touched. Nebula's heart exploded. It was no deep kiss. No tongue like she had seen in movies. Just their lips touching and moving at each other. Peter's hand still rests on her cheek, pulling her closer, wandering on her nape. Nebula shivered under the touch. Their lips broke apart. Their eyes opened again and continued looking at each other. Don't want to break that romantic moment right now. But do you mind if I lay down? My body hurts like shit. Nebula opened her mouth to say something, but Peter already had laid down, letting out a hurt sound. Kicking off his shoes, watching him getting comfortable in her bed, Nebula got lost in her thoughts. This was feeling odd. Was this it? Were they a thing now? It felt anticlimactic, but maybe that is how it was. Her thoughts were interrupted as Peter's hand grabbed her nape, pulling her into his arms. Their lips touched again. Barely a kiss, but it was enough for Nebula's stomach to tingle. Feeling brave, she wrapped her arms around him. His palms stroked her head. It was a sensation she hadn't felt. It felt weird, but in a way she could imagine growing to like. I love you, Nebula, and I don't regret what I've done, but I'm sorry I made you worry. Worry is a really calm word for what we all went through, Peter. She signed. Never do that again. Can't promise that. Love makes me crazy. And right now I'm a lovesick lunatic. She grunted in response. He truly was an idiot. But now he was hers. I know you would have done the same. Maybe, but I can't die. At last, not so fast. Doesn't make you less of a lovesick lunatic as I am. Nebula wanted to respond, but was interrupted by Peter yawning and pulling her blanket over himself as well. What are you doing? Sleeping? Listen here, sweetheart. I know you haven't slept in days, so I will stay here and wait until you fall asleep. This time better for real. We've been dating for 10 minutes, and you already want to sleep with me in my bed? Pretty sure you jumped a few steps. Setting herself in a more comfortable position, she fought with the urge to lay her hand anywhere near or even on Peter. Would it be too early to be that curious? But Peter took the decision away from her as he planted a kiss on her temple. That short touch he had given her 3 nights ago had been a kiss on her temple all along. Her hand wandered over his chest, right above his heart. The rhythm was calming, so she stayed there, looking up at Peter one last time, greeted by his wonderful warm eyes. Nebula felt her mouth twitch into a smile. Feeling his hand stroking her head made her sleepy, so she tucked herself a bit more closer to Peter, using his bicep as a pillow. Her eyes shut close, and she felt herself drifting off slowly to sleep. Watching Nebula finally falling asleep after all those days filled Peter with relief. God knew his now girlfriend deserved all the rest she could get, and he was more than willing to guard her through a peaceful sleep.